I'm joined today by Bruce Stokes, Director of Global Economic Attitudes at the Pew Foundation. Welcome.
Good to be here.
So, indeed, you are your group. You're responsible for creating the global trends and attitudes for over 15 years, which is really incredible because you have so much data over time. Can you give us a few kind of bites of what you have found recently?
Well, recently we found that there had been a dramatic decline in both the favorability of the United States and confidence in the U.S. president. And these things over time tend to track each other. It's really impossible to know which drives the other, but the point is that if you graph them out in any one country or any region, they tend to follow each other. We were the first group in 2002, in our first international survey, we were the first to find a dramatic rise in anti-Americanism. Now, this was even before the Iraq War. We then were able to find a bounce back in terms of attitudes towards the U.S. after the election of Barack Obama. And then we were the first to find in 2017 a dramatic decline in both confidence in the U.S. president and in favorability of the United States.
Myself, I'm also one of these people who care about data and big data and predicting things based on data. One of the questions I always ask is how reliable you think the methods of collecting your data have been, and in the last elections, you know, we had some well-known failures in getting the predictions right. But you're doing this for a long time. What do you think?
Well, first, I'd be the first, I think, to admit that polling is both an art and a science. There is the science part of it is in the design of the survey and the rigor with which you do the design, the amount of time and money you put into making the design as accurate as humanly possible. In that regard, The Economist magazine calls us the gold standard of public opinion research around the world. At the same time, there's the art in how you design the question, how you word the question, the issues you choose to pursue, and how you interpret the data. What does the data tell us or not tell us in many cases? We feel very strongly that we do the best work in this area of anyone. By the same token, I always like to joke, you're only as good as your last survey. Yeah. Now, in terms of the U.S. election survey work, we should remember that the major reputable national surveys in the United States all got the popular vote estimate about right. They predicted that Clinton would get a more popular vote than Donald Trump. They predicted it somewhere between 2% and 3% more, and that's roughly what she got. What was wrong were some of the state-level polls in Wisconsin, in Michigan, Pennsylvania. And when we did the retrospective study, and we were asked by the Professional Association of Pollsters in the United States to actually do the retrospective study, what we concluded was that a lot of those surveys were done by small newspapers or radio and TV stations that don't do this very often, don't have a lot of money to spend. They weren't as professional, say, as the New York Times or whatever, and some of the other national polls. But also there were some judgment errors made. You tend to design these surveys based on the assumption of what happened in past elections. Polls in some of these states tended to underestimate the number of older people who would show up, older white people, lowly educated older white people in particular. But also, probably a bigger mistake was when you do a survey before an election, you ask people how recently they voted. Because the reality is when you get close to election, you want to know what are the opinions of the people who are likely to show up to vote. And you make an estimate based on past turnout and if people voted or not, how many new voters are going to be and how many traditional voters there will be. And if people haven't voted for the last 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or ever elections, they aren't a likely voter. There were a lot of people who had voted in the 2016 election who hadn't voted for years, if at all. And that was an understandable mistake that people made. And so but frankly, to be honest, I get this question all the time. People say, well, how can we trust polls? They were wrong about the U.S. election. Well, in fact, they were right about the U.S. election, but we don't elect people by the popular vote. We elect people, presidents of the United States, state by state, and that was the difference.
Indeed. And the other thing that the kind of work you do is not related to the electoral polling process, is that you are looking at the world at random times, not at times on elections, right? When you have high emotions and things can be much more unpredictable. So you get a chance to see, how people on a regular basis are feeling. So you avoid some of these traps of the polling. But remembering some of the things I read in the paper you gave us before your coming here, in your polling in, if I recall correctly, 37 countries, and in all but 2, the impression of the United States has gone down. So that is a little bit of disheartening. And I was wondering, do you think that this kind of change of attitude towards the U.S. can be reversible in the years to come, or once you lose trust in another, country, it takes a while to recover from it?
Well, that's a great question. It seems to be one we all should be thinking about. I mean, we don't know for sure. We do know that there was a decline in the favorability of the U.S. and confidence in the U.S. president, especially in Europe, throughout the Bush administration, and then it bounced back dramatically with the election of Barack Obama, declined a little bit in some countries, bounced back a little bit in others, and then literally has fallen off the edge of the table in many of these countries with the election of Donald Trump. So the experience with the transition from Bush to Obama suggests that there could be a rebound at some point from these low levels we see in terms of the support for the United States right now. On the other hand, we know from the Bush era that there was a collapse in favorability of the United States and confidence in the U.S. president under President Bush in the Middle East, and we never recovered under Obama. There was not a rebound the way you saw in Europe in particular, but also in other parts of the world. So history would suggest that, yes, you can recover, but you shouldn't presume you're going to recover. And only time will tell whether there's a recovery under Trump or not. Now, the Gallup organization, which does great polling, just released a poll earlier this week in far more countries, 137 countries, which showed, based on their historical trends, also a dramatic decline in confidence in the leadership of the United States. And we'll have another measure then to see whether over time that improves or stays low. Once there's a transition in leadership in the United States, does that change things? But there's really, we just know from the history that this is incredibly volatile, and it bears watching.
Because we are at Wellesley College, because our daily job is to teach students, we usually would like to give advice about what they should think about once they get outside of college and start living their lives in this new era of high technologies. I would like to ask your opinion, your advice. What advice would you give to our students about how they should view the world from now on?
Well, if you're asking me what they should do, how they should view the world personally, I'll tell you what I tell. I went to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, so I talk to seniors every year. And what I tell them is, don't go to graduate school right out of undergraduate school. You've been going to school for 16 years of your life. Do something else. You have no idea what the world is like until you go out there and do something else. And think of your life as a palette on which you can paint with different colors, and try something different. Join the Peace Corps. Go write the great American novel. Hitchhike around the world. Sure, if you want to go to Wall Street and work for Goldman Sachs, go ahead and do that. But realize that you have an opportunity when you're 22 or whatever that you'll never have again in your life to experiment with your life, to try out different you, to see who you really are. And unfortunately, I know too many young people who feel like they have to get on this treadmill and move forward in their careers at the age of 22. And I can say with strong conviction that everybody I know who's taken some time to do something different has never regretted it.
That's great. But let me ask you a little more specific question on that. So what we have experienced with this era of social media is that our concept of trust and our concept of what is true is being challenged. Should these younger generations worry about that? And what advice could you give them from your experience in life, maybe?
Well, there's two things. I come from a generation of people who came of age in the 50s and 60s. And I think that we had our own confrontation with truth in the 60s, where we realized that our government could lie to us. The 5 o'clock follies in Saigon, where the war was going really well, and in fact it was going horribly, was told to us every day. We were told that life could only get better and better. And white males of my age have seen their incomes stagnate in our country for my entire adult lifetime. There were implicit expectations that we were given that I think people saw as true. This was the way life was. We were much less diverse than we are today. The role of women was totally different when I was growing up than it is today. Now, I think those diversity and a changing role of women is an unadulterated good. But I think there are some people of my generation who have had real trouble with that change. And they feel they've been lied to by what to expect. So I think it's not just fake news that we need to worry about. It's the expectations we give to the next generation about what life is going to be like. And we have to, I think, understand that if we create expectations that can't be fulfilled, we should at least tell people these are probably expectations they can't assume are going to be true. Now, young people today tell me we're much more attuned to change, acceptable of change than your generation ever was. I hope they're right, because I think my generation came of age assuming that what was that in that moment, what reality was going to be the reality forever. I vividly remember talking to some members of the United Auto Workers, and an older guy, this was in the 80s when we were facing a lot of competition from the Japanese. And a guy in the back of the room raised his hand and said, "I just don't get it. How can the Japanese be doing so well? We beat them in World War II." This was already 40 years after World War II. And so he assumed that that reality would never change. So one of the things I think we need to help people do is accept the fact that the pace of change in life is actually accelerating. But the flip of that is it's all incumbent on all of us to help people adjust to the fact that the pace of change is accelerating. We ask people in our surveys periodically, how do you feel about the pace of change in your life? And almost everywhere, except in a couple of countries like China, people say, oh, pace of life is too fast. Well, I dare say in the 1800s, people thought the pace of life was changed from the 1700s. But I think it's undeniable the pace of change is accelerated, and people are having a difficult time adjusting. Overwhelmingly, especially in the West, in Europe, United States, people tell us that their traditional way of life is getting lost. Now, we don't know what they mean exactly about that, but they probably don't either. It's just something's wrong. And I think, reap the consequences of that with the populist movement in the United States or the populist movement in Europe, where people are trying to dial back to a society which they can't dial back to objectively, but they are telling us they aren't going to go peacefully into the sunset. They're going to vote for the Front National in France, or they're going to vote for the AfD in Germany. So I do think that we need to help people understand that part of this truth debate is how much their reality is going to be changing over their lifetime. Now, there's a practical, the fake news debate, which is the hotter topic right now. My advice to people is try to expose yourself to as much information as you humanly can absorb. Don't assume you're going to get that on Twitter or Facebook. Read long form, not just short form, because we all are. I find it in myself. I used to be easily willing to read much longer stuff than I am now, and that's probably not good. Most importantly, it seems to me, understand that other people may interpret reality different than you do. And that interpretation of reality is very likely based on emotion, not reason. And I think one of the hardest things, especially for the young women you teach, people with a strong educational background, is they believe the world should be rational. And when they encounter the fact that it's not rational, and that many people don't act on reason but on emotion, they look down on those people. We shouldn't do that. Most average human beings don't have time or the interest to figure out the world the way a well-educated person might want to. They're going to move on emotion, and we have to accept that and try to work with that. And we will fail to, if we fail to do that, we will constantly be surprised by the outcomes in politics and in the marketplace. I mean, Henry Ford, for many years, refused to sell cars except that were painted black, because it was totally irrational. It's the same car under the hood if it's blue or it's red or it's black, so I'm just going to do black cars because this is cheaper. Until his competitors started to sell more cars because they were painted differently. We operate in the marketplace on emotion in many cases. Why do we expect that people are going to act totally based on reason in other settings?
Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.